Hello and a very warm welcome. Russia is a key defense partner of both India and China. In case there's a conflict between Delhi and Beijing, what will be Moscow's role? Can India count on Russia to be a neutral and reliable weapons and spare parts supplier? Or will increasingly close Sino-Russian military ties push Moscow to shut the tap of crucial supplies to India in case the line of actual control lights up? So much time in India is spent looking at how the US perceives the India-China conflict, but there isn't enough focus on the one country which holds sway both in Delhi and in Beijing. And in case there's a conflict, Moscow will have a crucial role to play. Joining me for this special India-Russia-China security dialogue, I want to start by introducing Mr. Kanwal Sibal, distinguished former Foreign Secretary. With me is Nandan Unnikrishnan, one of India's top Russia hands, distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. For a perspective from Russia, we're joined by Alexey Kupriyanov, research fellow at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Let me start by putting my first question to Mr. Kanwal Sibal. This is the one question that many people who are watching have in their minds. China and Russia are getting increasingly close economically and militarily. The Indian Defense Minister is presently in Moscow. In case things go south between India and China along the line of actual control, what do you, Mr. Sibal, believe will be Moscow's role in such a conflict?
Firstly, you have to understand that Russia has become very close to China, not because of India. This is because of pressure from the United States and from Europe after the Ukraine crisis and the annexation of Crimea. But even before that, NATO expansion and interference in Russia's internal affairs, regime change policies around Russia's periphery, and of course, demonization of Putin personally. So when it comes to India and China, Russia will remain neutral. Russia will not.
You're suggesting that Russia will remain neutral in case there is a conflict, but there is now increasing economic dependence of Moscow on Beijing. Nandan Unnikrishnan, could that tilt the neutrality scale? We've already seen in the People's Daily, the official daily of the Chinese Communist Party, a post that's been put up today, which is asking Moscow not to sell weapons at this time to India. This is the position taken by the People's Daily in a post that they've put out to Asia Watchers. What are you making of the push from Beijing, and how do you think Moscow will react?
I tend to agree with what Mr. Sibal said, that Moscow at this stage will not do anything that will harm India's strategic interests. I also believe, I think we understand that there is a close relationship between Russia and China, but I don't think it has reached a stage where there is complete dependency on the Russian side on economic help from China. In fact, my belief is that the relationship has run its course in a sense, primarily because the Chinese did not respond in the way the Russians wanted with economic support. So the short answer to that question is, I don't think India is going to suffer because the Russians are being pressured by the Chinese.
So both the Indian experts on our broadcast have started this conversation by saying that they expect Moscow to remain neutral. I want to go across to the two Russian guests on our show, starting with Alexey Kupriyanov. Your sense at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, do you believe, sir, that Moscow will indeed remain neutral? It's been one of our longest standing military partners, but it sold many weapon systems to Beijing recently. Sitting where you are, how do you view this question?
Well, I absolutely agree with Mr. Unnikrishnan, Mr. Kanwal. Moscow is not interested in aggravating the situation between India and China, because India and China both are our strategic partners. Moscow doesn't want to choose and will do everything so that it does not to have to choose. One of the priorities for Russia is a peace in Eurasia, and it's possible only if all three great Eurasian powers are in peace. We do not want to support India against China or China against India. We want India and China to stop looking at each other with suspicion. We you want to soften and affect your hearts and help India and China trust each other more. And I'd like to add that Russia is not, of course, is junior partner of China and will never be. Our motto is not always together, but never against each other. It's a very good motto that shows that we are a reliable partner and you can rely on us, but we are not going to dance to the tune of Beijing.
That's very assuring to hear. Vasily Kashin, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the National Research University. Your sense of the same question, would Moscow continue to remain neutral, or do you believe because of increasing economic and military ties there is a possibility that Moscow leans towards Beijing?
Well, I think what happened between China and India is very bad news for Moscow, and Russia is absolutely not interested in any kind of conflict between China and India, which are key partners of Russia in Asia. In such an unfortunate situation, Russia would do everything possible just to stay away from this, not to get involved on any side, and just try to maintain the current relationship between between Russia and India and Russia and China. And the dependence on Russia on China shouldn't be overestimated. First of all, the key economic partner of Russia is still not China, but European Union, and they are not even comparable. European Union takes more than 40% of Russian external trade, China about 15%. Second, although trade with China is growing, China is not an important source of financing for Russia. Russia is not taking Chinese loans. Russian public debt Russia is very low, so there is no way it can impact the decision making. In terms of defense cooperation, it's our cooperation with China and our cooperation with India are comparable. We have significant arms trade and significant military-to-military contacts with both powers. With Chinese, there have been more growth in the recent years, but still it's about the same level. The Chinese are ready to commit more forces for joint exercises, but in general, our activity with the Chinese is aimed at two goals: containing the United States and increasing trust along the Russian-Chinese border. We are not interested in any involvement.
Okay, so let's build on what you're saying, because at this moment India and China are locked in an intense conflict. At the same time, China and the United States are locked in conflict, and despite what Donald Trump may say, there is antagonism in the relationship between Moscow and Washington DC, and therefore, Kanwal Sibal, does that then tilt the scales in some senses, because Russia and China far more proximate in the current geopolitical conditions, and India is increasingly drawing closer to the US?
In fact,
no, look, our Russian friend has explained very well what the situation is with regard to Russia's position on India-China confrontation, which is building up. Now, with regard to our improved ties with the United States and Russia's very difficult relationship with the United States, these are facts on the ground, but they have been facts on the ground since a long time. It's nothing new. It's not as if the situation occurred yesterday. And both sides, over the years, have been in touch with each other at the highest levels. The regular high-level summits are taking place. At other levels, contacts are being maintained. There has been a lot of orders placed by India on Russia. We have defied this CATSA legislation, and we are going ahead with the purchase of S-400. So it's not as if we have taken steps to somehow decrease the level of our defense ties with Russia. On the energy side, we have moved far ahead. In my time when I was ambassador there, we had not been able to make much headway despite excellent political relations. But now, if you look at what is happening, the investments Russia has made in India, the investments India has made in Russia in the energy sector, they are phenomenal compared to the past. So I don't think that now, look, if Russia is concerned about our improved ties with the United States, then India can legitimately be concerned about improved Russian ties with China. But this is not a factor in our relationship. We have the Russia-India-China dialogue. We have the BRICS. We have the SCO, in which Russia, India, and China and others are cooperating. And there's a huge program of cooperation under these organizations. So these relations are being maintained. And I think we've gone over the phase where Russia is unduly concerned about our ties with the...
Wesley Keshan, whether it is the Chinook or the Apache or the M777, there have been multiple defense purchases, substantial defense purchases that have gone to arms companies in the US. Each of those had some Russian arms maker hoping to sell that product to India, but they lost out. Whereas in years gone by, India was almost entirely dependent on Russia for its arms imports. How does Moscow view India's increasing purchases from Washington and from US-based companies, and does that leave a sour taste in the mouth?
Well, in some cases, when we are talking about these purchases, in some cases we are talking about equipment which is not really produced in Russia. For example, maritime patrol aircraft. Yet at the same time, it's well known that India has been pursuing policy of diversification of defense industrial ties since since Cold War period. Indians always tried not to be dependent on one source of defense technology, always tried to maintain certain level of cooperation with European Union, and in some cases with the US. The problem with the US is that Americans are always attaching political strings to any arms deals, and to our understanding, this is a clear limitation. India wants to maintain strategic autonomy. India doesn't want to be anyone's junior ally, even against China, and that would limit the degree to which India would be capable to cooperate with US in defense industry, because the Americans are very particular about that. Once your political ties with US deteriorate, you face huge constraints. You can look at the example of Turkey, which paid for the fighters, for F-35 fighters, and now they cannot get them.
Nandan Unnikrishnan, way back in 2002, you and I had gone to Moscow and then to Siberia, Irkutsk, where we were with the the manufacturers of the Sukhoi 30 and Rosboron export. And the reality of that time is that in these years, do you see Russia's technical prowess in defense having slipped a few notches? What's your broad sense of what Russia offers to India militarily in comparison with what's on the drawing board with the United States?
Well, Rahul, this is a very complex question because, for example, if you look at technologies like hypersonics, the Russians seem to be ahead of most, at least in terms of what they're able to test publicly. There may be other areas in which they are slipping behind. That is also something that one cannot really identify at this stage. But it is important to note something else. It is important to note that today, whether one likes it or not, Russia is still the only country which is willing to give you some strategic platforms. For example, a nuclear-powered submarine. However much we can sort of debate it, the question is there is no other country that is offering it to us.
Even the S-400 for that matter.
Well, S-400, the Americans are offering some kind of combination of Patriot and THAAD. Yes, it's more expensive, but let's say that there is something in the offing. But In this, for example, nobody is offering us a nuclear submarine. And let's also be very clear about another thing. The Russians, the Indians, the US, the Chinese, all of us know who that nuclear submarine is going to be used against. So, I mean, if to talk about neutrality of Russia in this particular situation, I think they have already shown, in a sense, which side of the fence they are. But at the same time, you cannot argue with them that they should suppress their national interest, whatever is their current national interest, to favor someone else's. Nobody does it. We have never done it. So I think sometimes...
No, but we've seen, Nandan, the fact that Beijing used its economic leverage over Australia, banned beef exports, banned the imports of beef and wine, and that hit Australia badly. In the People's Daily just today, there is an article suggesting that Russia should not sell arms to India at a time of conflict. What's to stop China from applying the same kind of pressure against Russia?
Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that the Chinese, look, we have to recognize the fact that Chinese are becoming increasingly aware of their power, and they are doing what great powers do. They are assertively trying to defend what they consider to be their national interests. It is also my view, and I would agree with both Mr. Sibal and Mr. Kashan, that the Russians at this stage, at least today, are not interested in being a junior partner to China. And it is in that context, I feel, that the Chinese will not be able to dictate the policy towards India to Russia. A few years down the line, I don't know, but that is astrology. Right now, as a realist looking at the situation today, I would say that Chinese ability to dictate Russia's India policy is still limited.
Alexey Kupriyanov, are you concerned about Beijing exercising whatever economic leverage it's built over the last few years to try and force Russia, even if you started out by saying that Moscow would like to remain neutral, but we've seen how Beijing is pushing back against Australia and using all kinds of, essentially weaponizing trade, and they could do potentially the same with Russia as well?
I absolutely agree with Mr. Unikrishnan. Now Beijing has not any leverages against Russia. We are not Australia. We are a great power. In fact, we have our sovereignty. We have our independent foreign policy. And one of pillars of this independent foreign policy is a friendship with India. So now, in fact, we are ready to sell India new weapons, maybe much more sophisticated than we sell to China.
But the reality, Alexei, is that of late, the reliability of delivery as per timeline with Russia has slipped. Russia's own ability to manufacture its own products in the manner in which they've committed, that's taken a hit. And therefore, even though the intent stays strong, the reality of the military complex is such that Russia is no longer quite as formidable as it once used to be. Is that not the case, sir?
I think the problem partly because of sanctions, and I think that we will solve this problem just in a few years. So I see no problem here.
Nandan, you want to come in on this? Even though the Russians may have the intent, the reality is the military complex is no longer as formidable as it used to be during the Soviet Union, even immediately after the Soviet Union.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you in the sense that I don't know about the formidableness of the Russian military-industrial complex. I would be still a little wary of, yeah, it's definitely less than the Soviet. But as you pointed out, there are some internal structural problems they have which sometimes affect the supply of spares to India. But let us also understand that the delays in spares, part of the problem lies with us. It always takes two hands to clap. So if we start deciding that we are going to give a order for something, today and expect that it will be delivered tomorrow, that is quite unlikely to happen. So this is something I think that both sides have to address.
So you're saying order today and expect tomorrow, which is exactly why Rajnath Singh is in Moscow in the hope that a lot of what was in the pipeline can be expedited and what's already been ordered can be speed delivered, as it were. Vasily
Yes.
Kashin, what is the internal situation in Russia? And I want to play out for our viewers the data sets that we've built with Nandan's help about what weapon systems we need and what are in the pipeline, and the ability of the military complex to deliver those very quickly. We're almost expecting them, as Nandan said, pretty much tomorrow.
We should understand that Russian defense industrial complex now is probably in the best state it used to be since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are some production capabilities which we don't have because they never existed on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Why do you say it's the strongest? I'm sorry. Why do you say it's in the strongest position that it's been since the fall of the Soviet Empire?
Because we managed to fulfill our rearmament programs, like State Armament Program 2022 and the current ongoing Program 2027 to the fullest degree we could hope for. Basically, every production chain which is located on the Russian territory is working well. We have problems in areas where we used to be reliant on cooperation with Europe and Ukraine, such as power plants for surface ships. We are solving these problems. If we talk about the speed of delivery, of course, the large platforms such as fighter jets or heavy surface-to-air missile systems, they have certain production cycle. Once you sign a contract, they start working, and usually it takes a significant amount of time to deliver. If you want some urgent delivery during the conflict, you need some expedited procedures, and it's being done differently. Probably something could be moved from the stockpile of the Russian military, which would be much faster, but it would be less sophisticated stuff. But this is achievable in some situations, if the situation is considered
Mr. Kanwal, you've been in some positions of the kind that the current defense minister and the defense secretary are in. If we were to place orders and say that from your existing stockpiles or reserves, can the S-400 surface-to-air missile, even if it's not exactly to the specifications India ordered, can you do some jugaad and send it across to us because we need it against the Chinese? Is that a functional way in which things can actually operate, or is it just much easier said than done?
No, not for a very sophisticated item like the S-400. You can't do that kind of a thing and say, give us whatever you have, even if it doesn't measure up to the specifications that we have agreed upon. Because these are platforms which are going to be with you and will be surfaced for the next few decades. And you can't take a decision of this nature so lightly. But yes, we've seen during Kargil, for instance, and the Russians gave us urgent material from their own stockpiles. And President Putin, in my presence, has been telling this to our leaders about the Russian willingness to support us in critical situations, and that Russia will always be a steadfast, reliable partner. Remember, Russia has never sanctioned us. We've had sanctions on the United States and the European Union, but Russia has never sanctioned us. And this threat that the Chinese newspaper is making will be viewed very negatively by Russia. It's a slight and an insult to Russia to tell them that they should not sell arms to India. So I think the Chinese are making a very serious mistake. Russia has a very different notion of itself, of its prestige, of its power, of its status, as was rightly brought out, and they're not going to succumb to these kind of pressures. And finally, as Nandan has said very rightly, if the S-400 is being given to us, it's nothing to do with Pakistan. We don't need S-400 against Pakistan. We need it against China. Similarly, the nuclear submarines. Similarly, some other platforms which they give us. They know very well why we want to use them, why we want to boost our defense capability and offense capability, and who it is directed against. This is part of the long tradition that we've had of a strong defense relationship between India and Russia. Though, of course, there are wrinkles here and there. with regard to spare parts and supplies and things like that. It's an old story. But one point I want to mention, you see, Russia has made tremendous advances in certain kind of weaponry. For example, the underwater cruise missiles, the hypersonic, and the intercontinental missile, which President Putin has himself spoken about. In fact, he personally mentioned all this weaponry which was intended to demonstrate to the Americans that they're not going to be cowed down by United States in terms of their ABM systems and everything else. They're developing technologies against which any defense that America may put up will not be sufficient, and therefore the overall strategic balance will not be disturbed. So Russia has made, as was rightly said, big advances in certain technologies, but these are not the technologies that we are looking at or looking for.
So
and therefore,
build on this, Nandan. You know, I don't think in current Indian imagination it is fully registered and appreciated how reliable Russia and the erstwhile Soviet Union have been at every point in India's history when there's been a crisis. You know, the United States has held back, imposed sanctions at the most inopportune times, whereas this young generation of Indians doesn't fully appreciate just how reliable at the worst times when India's sovereignty has been challenged, Russia has been. So can you dwell on that for a moment?
Well, actually, you know, it's just a historical vignette, as it were. Our first major contract for Russian defense systems was signed in 1962, just before the war with China. We signed our contracts for the MiG-21s. So, you know, I know there are a lot of people who believe that Russia was not with us in 1962, but the fact is that they were not with China either. So we now, if you look back and come to this situation, they were willing to supply arms to you at that stage. Yes, the contract would have been fulfilled only in 63, but even today they are doing the same thing. They are not going to at any stage do or take actions that affect India's strategic interests vis-a-vis China. The point, however, I would like to make and stress that when it comes to national interest of a particular country, sometimes that country takes steps which could inadvertently affect the other. I mean, one example I would give you is Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan. That definitely went against India's interest. It was not in India's interest. But these events do happen, and if you have to now juxtapose all this and look at today's situation, I think India can be fairly confident that Russia is not going to do anything that is going to harm Indian interests.
Vasily, and the final thing I want to end with, and I want your thoughts on this, that in years, in millennia gone by, in centuries gone by, there have been so many conflicts between erstwhile Chinese empires and erstwhile Russian empires, whereas India and Russia really have nothing to fight about. So therefore, any advanced weapon system that's sold to China can potentially, because of the reverse engineering that they do later, be used against Moscow if the relations deteriorate, whereas the chances of that happening with Delhi are almost zilch.
I would tend to agree, and the Russians have bitter experience with the Chinese, where the Chinese have bought their weapon systems and reverse engineered them. But the Russians have become slightly wiser. They nowadays do not sell systems to China which they think can directly harm them or which they do not think they can counter themselves. So to that extent, I think they are a little smarter. As far as India is concerned, here is one more vignette for you. Of all the nuclear arms that Russia has, there is one nation they do not target, and that is India.
And that's important because it suggests a kind of friendship that's deep, that's not always very current in the imagination, but a relationship that's held through thick and thin over the years. This has been a very fascinating conversation and a very assuring conversation as well about the strong belief in Moscow and in Delhi that Russia will remain neutral, and there's no question of wanting to shut the tap in case there's an escalation with India. In fact, even the suggestion from the People's Daily is most likely to be seen as an affront in Moscow. For the time being, Alexey Kupriyanov, Vasily Kashin, Nandan Unikrishnan and Kamal Sibal for joining me on this conversation. Thank you very much. We're slipping into a break. We'll have a lot more for you when we come back on the other side. Stay with us.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.